In the second part of chapter 2, Freud shares a dream that he had, and then he shows us how he went about interpreting that dream. Now, first we need a little context. Freud had been treating a patient named Irma for hysteria. Now, Irma had not fully accepted Freud's recommendations, and because of that, Freud believed she had only received a partial healing. Freud went on summer vacation, thus pausing the treatment, and on this vacation, he was visited by his friend Otto. Now, Otto knew Irma and her family, and he had recently seen them, so naturally Freud asked about Irma, and Otto replied that Irma was better, but not quite well. Freud felt insulted by these words. He feared that Otto believed Freud's treatment of Irma had been inadequate, and Freud also feared that Otto had disparaged Freud to Irma's family. Freud went to sleep one night, and then he had a dream which historians now refer to as Irma's injection. Freud is in a large hall with many people. He notices that Irma is there. He pulls Irma aside and reproaches her for not accepting his recommendation, saying, "If you still get pains, it's really only your fault." Irma replies, "If only you knew the pains I've got now in my throat and stomach and abdomen. It's choking me." Freud grows alarmed and notices that she looks pale and puffy. He wonders if in his treatment of her he had overlooked that she might have an organic illness. He takes her over to the window to look down her throat. At first she shows signs of recalcitrance, like a woman wearing dentures, meaning she isn't cooperating, isn't opening her mouth. She then opens her mouth wide and Freud sees something truly horrifying. On the right there's a big white patch, but then further down her throat he sees nasal bones. Maybe you didn't hear that. Down Irma's throat, Freud sees nasal bones. Freud immediately summons Dr. M. Dr. M looks down Irma's throat and confirms, "Yep, sure enough, you've got nasal bones in your throat." Dr. M looks different than usual. He's pale, he walks with a limp, his chin is clean shaven. Freud now notices that Otto is standing beside Irma. And now his friend Leopold is standing there, and Leopold is percussing her through her bodice, meaning he's performing a medical examination on her. And then Leopold says, "She has a dull area down on the left." Leopold also says that a portion of the skin on her left shoulder is infiltrated. This is something that Freud has already noticed. Dr. M then says, "There's no doubt it's an infection, but no matter, dysentery will supervene and the toxin will be eliminated." All the men are aware of the origin of Irma's infection. Shortly before this evening, Freud learns Otto had given her an injection of propyls, propionic acid, and trimethylamine. Freud can see before him the formula for this printed in heavy type. Injections of this sort, he thinks, should not be made so thoughtlessly. And to make matters worse, the syringe Otto had used had not been clean. So now let's see how Freud goes about interpreting this dream. Now, to understand his interpretation, we need to keep 4 principles in mind, and Freud expounds upon these principles later in the book. First, when interpreting a dream, find the day residue. Find the connections between the dream and what had happened in the dreamer's life the day of the dream. Second, find the wish. Freud believes that all dreams contain wishes. All dreams are essentially expressions of wishes, so to understand the dream, we have to find the wish. Third, look for condensations and displacements. A condensation is when 2 things are taken and put together, fused together in some way. For example, if I have a dream in which my mother has a mustache, well, in real life, I know that my stepfather has a mustache. So it could be that in the dream universe, in this particular dream, my mom and stepdad, for whatever reason, have been fused into one. And a displacement is simply when one object is replaced with another object. This happens often in dreams, as we'll see. And finally, unpack the associations. This seems to be the most important principle in dream interpretation. And this means that Freud teaches us the way to understand a dream is to break a dream down into its smaller elements. And for each element, ask yourself what comes to mind when you think of that element. And then what comes to mind when you think of the thing that you thought of when you thought of the first element, if that makes sense. Now let's go and step by step see how Freud interprets this dream. The first dream image is an example of day residue. In real life, Freud had been planning a birthday party for his wife, and he had invited Irma and her family, and he was a little worried about seeing Irma at the party. The second scene is another example of day residue. Here, Freud is reproaching Irma for not taking his recommendation. In real life, that's something that Freud had been preoccupied with, blaming Irma, feeling frustrated, not understanding why she didn't listen to him. In the third scene, we see both a wish and displacement. Freud wonders if he's overlooked an organic illness. Now, in real life, Freud had not been treating Irma for an organic illness, but for a psychological illness, for hysteria. If it were the case, and we'll talk more about this later, if it were the case that Irma, in fact, had an organic illness, then Freud couldn't be to blame for her not getting better. Freud notices that Irma looks pale and puffy. In real life, Irma did not look pale or puffy, so Freud suspects that someone else is being substituted for her here. In other words, that displacement is occurring. Freud next takes Irma to the window, and this scene of Freud and Irma standing by the window reminds Freud of a time he saw Irma's friend standing by a window. And then Freud has a number of thoughts about Irma's friend that just come to mind. He's wondered if Irma's friend suffers from hysteria. He's wondered if she might want him to treat her. He's wondered if he might have more success with the friend than he's had with Irma. Freud then has some associations about Dr. M. Dr. M had been treating Irma's friend. Dr. M did not think she had hysteria, but that she had an organic illness. Freud then looks down Irma's throat and he sees a white patch and nasal bones. As he reflects on the dream, a number of thoughts come to mind. When he thinks about the white patch, he's reminded of Irma's friend, and a white patch would have been congruent with the illness that Dr. M said she had. Freud also thinks about a time his daughter was ill and had white patches in her throat. Freud continues to think about the white patch and nasal bones, and then he thinks about his own health. And he had nasal swellings himself, and he had been using cocaine to treat these nasal swellings. This leads to a thought of a female patient, and she had a physical malady, and following Freud's example, had used cocaine to treat the malady and had developed an infection, something that caused Freud some guilt. And Freud next thought of a friend from several years ago. And several years earlier, Freud had been more liberal in his use and advocacy of cocaine. This friend had followed Freud's example and ended up overdosing and dying from cocaine. Dr. M then appears, and Freud associates to a time in which he had prescribed a drug to one of his patients, and the patient had a severe allergic reaction to the drug, and Dr. M then came to the rescue and provided some relief for the patient. Freud thinks about this memory, and then he remembers that the patient's name was the same name as his daughter, the daughter who he has associated to earlier in the dream. Freud remembers that in the dream, Dr. M doesn't quite look like Dr. M. He's pale. He walks with a limp. He's clean shaven. And this actually reminds Freud of his brother. So here we have an example of condensation. It's Dr. M and it's also Freud's brother in one. And Freud thinks about these two men and he realizes that they have something in common. And that is that recently both men have rejected a suggestion that Freud had made to them. Freud next notices that Otto and then Leopold are standing by Irma, and he thinks about Otto and Leopold, and he has a number of associations about them. And years earlier, Freud had been working at a children's hospital. They had both been his assistants, and a number of memories come to Freud. And in these memories, simply put, Leopold was a more thorough and a more competent physician. And Freud realizes now what's going on in the dream. So he had felt threatened by Otto. Otto had, in some sense, questioned Freud's competence. So by putting Leopold in the dream, the superior physician, Freud, in a sense, was getting his revenge on Otto. And Freud realizes that this is what he's done in the dream with Irma and Irma's friend. Irma had caused him problems, had provided perhaps some evidence that maybe Freud wasn't competent, but Irma's friend, according to Freud's fantasies anyway, would have been a better patient and would have gotten better. In other words, really the problem isn't Freud, the problem is Irma. Dr. M then says, there's no doubt it's an infection, but no matter, dysentery will supervene and the toxin will be eliminated. Now, in real life, this would have been an absolutely ridiculous and stupid thing to say, and Freud realizes that in the dream world, he's getting revenge on Dr. M by making Dr. M appear to be a schmuck. Freud then thinks about Otto, and Otto gave Irma an injection of propionic acid. And this reminds Freud that in real life, Otto had given Freud and his wife a liqueur. In the previous evening, Freud and Martha opened the liqueur, and the thing smelled awful. It smelled like gasoline. And Martha said, okay, we can't drink it. Maybe we should give it to the servants. And Freud said, what? I don't want to kill the servants. This stuff is awful. So here's another example in the dream of Freud getting some revenge on Otto. Freud further reflects on Otto, and there's this comment that the syringe that he used to inject Irma had not been clean. So here again, we're seeing that Otto isn't so competent. Otto is a schmuck. Finally, trimethylamine appears in the dream, and Freud thinks about trimethylamine, and one of his close friends believed that trimethylamine was a product of one's sexual metabolism. And this friend was very sympathetic to Freud, and both the friend and Freud believed that many maladies, physical and otherwise, are caused by our sexuality or by our repression of our sexuality. So by introducing this friend into the dream, Freud is, in a sense, getting an ally against his enemies, those who have made him look foolish, namely Irma and Otto and Dr. M. Freud brings all this together and interprets the dream as follows. Freud's underlying wish, which we find in the dream, is that he wants to be a competent, good physician, and he wants to be perceived as a competent, good physician. In reality, there was some evidence to suggest that maybe Freud was not a great physician. For example, Irma had not gotten better, and Dr. M and Otto seemed to maybe imply that they questioned Freud's competence as a physician. So what the dream does is it provides a number of pieces of evidence suggesting that Freud, in fact, is a good physician. Evidence number 1, Irma is to blame. Irma didn't get better not because Freud's incompetent, but because she didn't follow his recommendation, and we see this in the dream. Evidence number 2, well, maybe it was an organic illness, meaning Irma didn't get better not because Freud failed, but because there was an organic illness and Freud had been treating her for hysteria. Evidence number 3, Irma's not having sex. Now, in real life, Irma was a widow. Freud, again, believed she was suffering from hysteria, and the cure to hysteria was not to be repressed in your sexuality. So if she was a widow not having sex, then that would be the cause for her illness, not Freud's incompetence. And the dream makes this argument in a really sort of subtle way, and I would say it's by introducing Freud's friend who was sympathetic with his theories about sexuality. And finally, evidence number 4 is Otto's a schmuck. He gave her an injection with a dirty syringe. He gave her an injection with all these awful chemicals that appeared in the liqueur. Now, Freud notes that all these pieces of evidence are not consistent with one another. In fact, some of them contradict one another. he gets this, and he says that this whole plea that his dream is making reminds him of the defense of a man who has returned a tea kettle to his neighbor. And the neighbor says, "You've damaged my tea kettle." And the man responds first by saying, "What are you talking about? This tea kettle is not damaged." And then the man says, "Okay, it's damaged, but this hole was in it before I even borrowed it." And finally the man says, "Tea kettle? What tea kettle? I never borrowed your tea kettle." So the dream universe is not always logically consistent. What it does, and we'll see more of this in later videos, is it expresses our wishes however it can. Now, Freud also notes that some elements in the dream do not exonerate him from being a bad physician. So, for example, there's this memory in the dream of the patient that Freud had failed that Dr. M came and helped with. There's the memory in the dream of this female patient who had followed Freud's example and had an infection caused by cocaine. And there's finally this memory of the friend who had followed Freud's example and died from cocaine. So Freud thinks more about this, and then he finally has a solution. And he says, all these incidents, they show that, yes, I'm imperfect, but they also show that I'm conscientious. They show that I care about people. They show, in other words, that I'm an imperfect but good physician. Okay, that's all we have for today. I hope you're enjoying this book as much as I am, and I will see you next time.